Between January and October 1943, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress went from being just an aircraft to the stuff of legends when these heavy bombers launched massive air raids deep into Germany to target the heavily defended industrial heartland. This was the time of the 8th Air Force's unescorted daylight precision bombing. And while this form of aerial assault was virtually a belief system to the Air Force officers who devised and implemented it, it proved to be deeply flawed. These flaws led to catastrophic results that its designers could never have imagined. Unescorted daylight precision bombing was a concept developed in the 1930s at the Army Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama. The Air Force stood alone in accepting this strategy. The Navy rejected it in favor of dive bombing. When the British realized they could not hit targets with precision, they turned to night area bombing. In addition to going it alone, the Air Force's long-range unescorted bombing missions would be carried out by bombers, which raised serious concerns. On August 16, 1942, aviation expert Peter Masefield summed up British and American concerns when he wrote,
"American heavy bombers, the latest Fortresses and Liberators, are not suited for bombing in Europe. Their bomb loads are small, their armor and armament are not up to the standards now considered necessary, and their speeds are slow."
Despite these concerns, Air Force officers dedicated to unescorted daylight precision bombing remained unconvinced. They shared an almost obsessive belief in a type of aerial warfare proposed by Italian Army officer Giulio Douhet. He wrote,
"A slower, heavily armed plane, able to clear its way with its own armament, can always get the better of a faster pursuit plane. A fleet of slower, heavily armed planes is in a position to stand up to the fire of enemy pursuit planes and carry out its mission successfully."
General William Billy Mitchell, widely regarded as the founding father of the United States Air Force, shared this viewpoint, as did many of the officers who served under him. By the outbreak of World War II, many of these officers had risen through the ranks to senior command positions. Despite the changes in military aviation, particularly fighter technology, that occurred in the 20 years between the two wars, many of these men remained steadfastly committed to Douhet's and Mitchell's views on air warfare. Because of their rigid attitudes, no long-range escort fighters were planned to protect the invincible bombers. While these men worked tirelessly to promote the development of long-range heavy bombers, they made no efforts to protect these bombers with long-range escort fighters. They believed that escort fighters were not only unnecessary but also impossible to develop. In 1935, an Army Air Corps board concluded that the need for escort fighters has not yet been thoroughly demonstrated. In the end, the Air Force entered the Second World War without the semblance of a long-range escort fighter in its planning. The controversy surrounding unescorted daylight precision bombing began with the Casablanca Conference, which began on January 14, 1943, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, accompanied by their military staffs, met in Morocco to discuss the future conduct of the war. Churchill was dissatisfied with U.S. daylight bombing efforts to date, which had not yet succeeded in dropping a single bomb on Germany. He arrived determined to persuade Roosevelt to direct the United States Air Force to join the Royal Air Force's night bombing raids on Germany, which had been underway since 1940. Since August 17, 1942, the heavy bombers of the 8th Bomber Command had completed 27 missions, none of which had taken them into German territory. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, was a staunch supporter of daylight precision bombing. He persuaded Churchill that if the RAF continued to bomb Germany at night, he would bomb Germany during the day. Round-the-clock bombing would ensure that the devil had no rest. Churchill, pleased with this commitment, gave up his opposition to U.S. daylight bombing. It meant that the 8th Air Force Bomber Command would launch unescorted daylight bombing raids into Germany's heartlands. On January 27th, 3 days after the conference ended, the 8th Bomber Command launched its first unescorted heavy bomber raid into Germany. However, by doing so, they were setting in motion tactics based on World War I thinking, using weapon systems that had never been tested under these combat conditions. On this first raid, 91 unescorted bombers were sent to destroy the U-boat yards at Wilhelmshaven. However, due to bad weather, only 53 planes made it to their target. Fortunately, only 3 bombers were lost as a result of the defenders' surprise at the unexpected daylight raid. The majority of the elite Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were on the Eastern Front, fighting Russia. However, this would change over the next 7 months as the U.S. pushed their raids deeper into Germany. The Germans realized that if these attacks continued, their ability to wage war could be severely weakened. They proved grimly efficient in increasing the Luftwaffe's day fighter force in Germany, while U.S. losses continued to rise. In the April 17th attack on Bremen, 16 of the 106 bombers that reached their target were shot down. On a June 13th follow-up raid to Bremen, 26 of the 102 bombers that made it to their destination were lost. The substantial losses were further compounded by the uncertainty surrounding their impact on German war production. When the United States entered the war, German fighter plane production was at 360 per month. But by June 1943, German Air Minister Milch had increased it to 1,000 per month. As a result, on June 10, 1943, the combined chiefs of staff issued the point-blank directive, pushing German air production to the top of the 8th Bomber Command's priority list. The limited range of Lightning and Thunderbolt fighters meant that by the time they got to the German border, they would have to head back home. Thus, from the German border onwards, the B-17s were on their own. After examining crashed B-17s and B-24s, the Luftwaffe discovered a flaw in their protection. Bringing a bomber down required at least 20 shell hits when shot from the rear. However, the plane's lack of frontal armor meant that 4 or 5 20-millimeter hits from the front were enough to knock it out of the sky. With insufficient frontal firepower and fast closing speeds, B-17 and B-24 gunners had little chance of hitting the small, rapidly approaching target. In late July 1943, having recently assumed command of the 8th Bomber Command, General Frederick Anderson launched a series of raids known as Blitz Week. Despite the mixed results, 88 B-17s were shot down, and many more were damaged beyond repair. Meanwhile, in July, Germany's industry produced over 1,000 fighter aircraft. The Air Force believed that immediate action was necessary to halt the Luftwaffe's expansion, even though the Blitz Week losses highlighted the B-17's vulnerability in the absence of an effective fighter escort. Arnold, under pressure and impatient for results, placed the blame on a lack of aggressiveness by bomber commanders. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Bomber Command made its deepest penetration yet into Germany's industrial heartland of Bavaria. Under the plan, flying southeast from their bases in Britain, 376 bombers would penetrate deep into Germany as one powerful force, before splitting up into 2 groups near their target to attack the ball-bearing plant at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factories in Regensburg, situated only 109 miles apart. Instead of turning northwest to return to England, as the Germans expected, the Regensburg force would turn south over Italy and land at a U.S. base in North Africa. By striking 15 minutes ahead of the Schweinfurt force, the Regensburg force would attract the attention of the German fighters and then turn abruptly towards North Africa, confusing the Luftwaffe and leaving Schweinfurt open to attack without air cover. The most important aspect of making this plan a success would be the takeoff times. Because of bad weather, the Schweinfurt force launched 3.5 hours after the Regensburg force, resulting in 2 separate and unrelated bombing raids rather than a single, powerful, critically timed attack. By allowing the missions to proceed, Anderson gave the Luftwaffe plenty of time to focus their attack on each force separately. The German fighters formed mass formations before striking the bomber formations head-on. Lieutenant Edwin Frost, who was in the nose of a B-17, recalled,
"It was just pandemonium. It seemed that every gun was firing at once. The noise was terrific. Most fighters were coming straight ahead, tearing right through us."
A crew member recalled more than just the fighters and flak exploding all around them.
At those high altitudes, the cold was numbing as I sat and watched my fellow bombers being shot out of the sky in great numbers.
The losses were devastating. 147 of the 376 B-17s dispatched would never return to Britain, giving the 8th Air Force a staggering 39% loss rate. The air generals struggled to put a positive spin on the raid by claiming to have inflicted devastating damage on the targets, but the results proved insignificant. However, this fact would not be fully understood until the war was over. Losses continued to mount as 45 bombers were shot down while raiding Stuttgart on September 6th, followed by another 106 downed in the first 10 days of October. On Thursday, October 14th, 1943, the crews learned with gloom and dismay that their next destination would be a follow-up raid to Schweinfurt. When the mission was announced, the officers responded with boos and groans. At one briefing, the commanding officer concluded a pep talk with "good luck and good bombing," to which someone at the back added,
And goodbye.
After the first raid, the Luftwaffe had improved their defenses. They attacked the 291 B-17s just south of Aachen, when a lack of fuel forced the bombers' little friends to turn for home. Hundreds of German planes of various types swarmed the bomber formations on their way to and from their target. 229 bombers were able to reach Schweinfurt and drop their bombs. 60 never made it back across the English Channel. 5 crashed upon landing, and another 17 were scrapped. In addition, 142 of the remaining aircraft were damaged, indicating that only 11% of the 291 bombers dispatched returned undamaged. When the war began, the British and U.S. Air Forces were convinced that their bombing would be accurate. In fact, it never was. The U.S. Army Air Force believed in the accuracy of the Norden bomb sight, which they believed enabled them to hit a pickle barrel from a vast height in daylight. In perfect conditions on the testing grounds, the bomb sight had a respectable hit rate. But in combat conditions in Western Europe, it was found lacking. The losses for the entire month of October 1943 were grim. At this rate, an entirely new bomber force would have to be created almost every 3 months in order to sustain the current level of bomber offensive. It was clear that the bomber generals' unwavering commitment to unescorted daylight bombing throughout their entire military careers had failed, a military dogma shattered by the brutal realities of modern aerial warfare. The Air Force gave October 14th the nickname Black Thursday, and for good reason. It marked the end of unescorted daylight precision bombing, though some air generals refused to recognize it. Indeed, faith in unescorted daylight bombing died hard. A week after Black Thursday, planning was still underway for the next big raid. On October 22nd, at a meeting of the 8th Bomber Command Group leaders, it was announced that there would be no further unescorted raids into Germany, finally putting an end to the madness. All operational P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings in Britain would be modified to enable them to use drop tanks to extend their range. It was a tragic irony that long-range escort fighters would have been readily available if this had been implemented from the beginning. The reprieve that the German heartland had enjoyed from U.S. daylight bombing ended in February 1944, when hundreds of little friends began to race across German skies, protecting the heavies. When reports of dogfights deep inside Germany reached Goering, he dismissed them as absurd. But when confirmed, he was heard muttering, "We have lost the war." Goering was correct that the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed, although the brave young men of the 8th Air Force still had a lot of dying left to do. The U.S. heavy bombers initiated this clash by threatening the destruction of vital war industries, leaving the German fighters with no choice but to defend them. The resulting dogfights forced the Luftwaffe into a never-ending cycle of air battles against an ever-increasing number of American escort fighters. Soon, U.S. fighters on escort missions would fly ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies and actively searching for Luftwaffe interceptors. By the end of 1944, flak began to take a heavier toll on bombers, despite the introduction of advanced weapon systems that proved too little, too late. In a final act of desperation, the Luftwaffe formed ramming squadrons, but they proved ineffective. The bombers had become incidental as the escorts became the primary cause of the Luftwaffe's destruction. This was certainly not what the bomber generals had in mind when devising their unescorted daylight bombing strategy. The men under their command would pay the ultimate price for their unwavering faith in the invincible bomber. If you like this presentation, there are many more similar high-quality videos on my channel page.